I think it would be helpful maybe to start with a little bit of background on yourself, personally, politically, intellectually, um, and the kind of trajectory that led you to write this book. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that first, your background, how you became politicized, how you became particularly interested in Middle East as a subject, and the kind of key intellectual influences on you when you were beginning to work on this material.
Mm. Well, I'm Palestinian origin, so obviously from the get-go very interested in Middle East politics and particularly Palestine. And I spent a number of years living in Palestine, working in different areas during the Second Intifada, so during the early 2000s. So during that period, it was very clear to me that to understand what was going on in Palestine, you needed to look at the wider Middle East region. I was being politically active for about 30 years around different left politics, but really felt that in terms of Palestine, that there was a problem in the way that people looked at the struggle there, reducing it into basically a human rights struggle, and missing out the key questions around imperialism, the broader region, and it became clear through both the personal experience and political engagement that really the key issue is trying to understand capitalism in the Middle East region, and in particular the role of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and those other states. So understanding the role of the Gulf monarchies as capitalist states, and their influence over the wider region obviously relates deeply to oil. So that's kind of where my interest in oil emerges, and trying to think about how these states were incorporated into global capitalism, and then how they themselves had a major impact on class structures, state structures in the wider Middle East region. So, having gone through thinking through these kinds of questions, doing a PhD at York University, where I looked at class formation in the Gulf, and living for a couple of years in the Gulf, in Dubai, working there and engaging with issues around both the kind of bigger questions of capitalism, but also migrant labor and understanding migrant class structures as part of the Gulf social structures. I've wrote a number of books on these issues, and in particular having written and been engaged in some of the debates around the Arab uprisings in 2011, and seeing very clearly at that moment the way the Gulf states intervened in those struggles, and basically diverted them, tried to restore authoritarian regimes in Egypt and elsewhere. It really kind of brought home to me that fact that we need to kind of really center the Gulf in the politics of the region. And this more recently has raised the bigger questions about oil and oil's place in capitalism, because obviously understanding those Gulf states requires a theory of oil, and a way of looking at oil. And I was dissatisfied with the way that a lot of the literature around oil and capitalism within the kind of Marxist sphere, but also more generally, I thought was quite inadequate to understanding these debates.
Your parents were both from Palestine, and they were refugees, or they'd emigrated before 1948?
No, my father was a refugee in 48. My mother, Australian, but my father was 13 years old at the time of the Nakba, time of the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. Went to Egypt and basically grew up. Grew up in Egypt as a refugee. Later came to Jordan, and then eventually to Australia.
Mm. And so you studied at York. Were there particular teachers of yours, scholars based at York, Leo Panich, for example, I'm thinking of, or David McNally, or others who had a particular strong influence on the way you understood capitalism and class and so on?
Yes, I mean I was in the political science department at York and worked with Greg Albo, who was a big influence and continues to be a big influence on the way I think about kind of Marxism and also capitalism. And David McNally, Leo Panich. There's a range, I think, of really brilliant scholars who kind of were not afraid to put Marx and really kind of explore Marxism in some depth, which I think is quite unique in terms of the academic scene. But the other thing that I think was very unique about York is that it was engaged politically. So whether it be around struggles in Palestine, the Middle East, both the academics but as well as the students were very active and engaged in the politics. Also around questions of migration, migrant struggles in Toronto and more broadly in Canada. So you had a very vibrant, I think, political atmosphere that continues to this day. And I think that is one thing that really distinguishes York as a place to both be a scholar but also an activist.
Mm. But presumably I imagine that you had some differences as well with some of the perspectives put forward at that time. I mean, for example, the playing down of the question of inter-imperialist conflict by Leo Panich, for example, was that something that you disagreed with, or you found yourself more or less convergent with?
No, I do think the question of imperialism among it needed. I did have differences and continue to have differences with the way imperialism was theorized by Leo and others. I do think it's quite clear that we need to think about these inter-imperial rivalries. Not that I think there's an adequate kind of theorization of imperialism out there at the moment. Capitalism has changed, obviously, from the time of the classical theories of imperialism. But I do think one of the weaknesses in a lot of kind of Western approaches to Marxism is a tendency to focus on the core states and not consider the ways that places like the Gulf are actually quite central to how imperialism operates today. These states tend to be treated as in the worst case, people think of them as feudal hangovers, not as capitalist states. They think of them as being sites of undemocratic regimes ruled by ruling monarchies, but not really understanding that these are actually capitalist states. They have capitalist classes, they have working classes, and they're integrated into imperialism, into global capitalism in very specific ways that I think is quite central to understanding how imperialism operates today. And that I think is something that is missed in a lot of the discussions that focus on the United States or on Europe, and think about these like centers of global capitalism from very much from above. So there's a problem, I think, on the flip side also of the way that the world is often reduced to the imperial core and the periphery, or the colonizer and the colonized, and there are states and regions such as the Gulf that don't fit neatly into those categories, but actually are central to understanding how capitalism operates today. And that I think is extremely clear. It has become ever so clearer in the last 2 decades.
Mm. Do you find the concept of sub-imperialism a useful concept, and if so, in what way?
I think it's useful in the sense it does grapple with these other layers, these kind of the multiple hierarchies that exist within global capitalism. But I don't use the term specifically in relation to the Gulf states, partly because, at least up until very recently, these states lacked any kind of military clout. That's changed somewhat in the last few years, but they were very much within the American kind of military orbit. They were major consumers of military hardware from the United States, but they were under the umbrella protection of the US military. So in that sense, I think that that concept doesn't really fit. It's trying to grapple with the fact we have multiple hierarchies within global capitalism, but to call these states to not consider the kind of the specific ways that they're integrated in one sense into the core, but then have their own independent interests, I think is missed in that term.
It overestimates their autonomy, you think?
It's partly it's the question of autonomy, but also it's the question of how their capitalist classes are where they operate are not simply located in the Gulf states. They are integrated very deeply into the United Kingdom, for example, into the United States through investment flows, through joint ownership structures. So to think about these states as independent actors without considering the way their capitalist classes are very much integrated into those classical centers of power is missed out, I think, in those terms.
Right. And aside from the kind of figures that you cite at York, were there other intellectual influences on you? I'm wondering whether, for example, Marxists from the Arab world had any kind of impact on the way you thought about the region.
Certainly, I mean, you can point to figures in the Palestinian movement, Ghassan Kanafani, for example, Palestinian Marxist, who I think really, apart from his activism, was also, and his political work was also a serious Marxist and scholar of history, writing on, for example, the 1936 revolt in Palestine. People like Samir Amin, of course, also thinking through very clearly in a kind of I think sophisticated way, trying to understand value flows and the way that value that's produced in places like the Middle East circulates globally. These kinds of scholars, I think, are really ignored a lot in the kind of in some of the European and American debates around Marxism.
Is it? I mean, one could argue that one of the reasons, of course, there's the provincialism that it plays a role, but perhaps one of the reasons that Marxism from the Arab world is so little translated and discussed is because it's one of the regions in the global south where there was a communist movement, but perhaps where the Stalinist influence was very strong and tended to squeeze out more independent, dissident kind of voices. Is that a fair assessment, or would you challenge that?
I think that's true. I don't think the Middle East was unique in that respect. I think that's a global question. But I do think, looking at the experience of the communist movements, when we say communist movements, we're talking about obviously the communist parties, and there were big parties in Iraq, in Egypt, in Sudan, and elsewhere. But we're also talking about smaller left currents and communist groups that operated within that milieu. But it really struck me, both, personally being present and engaged in some of the politics of the region, the way that, particularly the question of the kind of role of the national bourgeoisie was poorly theorized among leftists, and that, I think, has also influenced the way that many Western Marxists look on the region. They tend, again, this is not unique to the Middle East, but the subordination of left struggles to basically the interests of a national bourgeoisie is, I think, one of the clear weaknesses of the movements, and it's why the movements have, every time there's been, you can look over the last 50, 60 years, every time there's been moments of revolt, of revolution, they quickly fall back into line, and it's the national bourgeoisie who basically takes it forward. I do think one thing, though, that's and this again bringing this back to the Gulf, thinking about the character of the national capitalism or the national bourgeoisies in the Middle East requires this regional outlook, in the sense that, and this, by the way, is something that Leo Panitch, I think, actually did get right in this sense, thinking about the way that bourgeois classes in, for example, Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates are part of those national capitalist classes in places like Egypt or Jordan or Lebanon. We can't necessarily think of those, for example, the Egyptian capital, as being an Egyptian nationality. Because of the internationalization of capital from the Gulf into places like Egypt, the capitalist class in those countries have become, or the Gulf has become a major kind of part of the capitalist classes in countries like Egypt, and therefore very much connected to the way the state operates and state formation has taken place. So thinking outside of these national silos and thinking about that regional scale is, I think, really important. But coming back to this point about the national bourgeoisie, I do think it is a weakness of the left, and a lot of it has to do with kind of the influence of Stalinism.
And the whole notion of a comprador bourgeoisie, for example, which is very problematic.
Yes, and this, again, coming back to what I said earlier about, if you think about somewhere like the Saudi capitalist class, it's not a comprador bourgeoisie. It's very much active globally. It has its own centers of accumulation, and both in the region and more widely. So again, to think just in terms of a core periphery, despite the importance of that notion in the development of thinking about imperialism, today I think is inadequate in terms of understanding the role of places like the Gulf. The other interesting thing here, and again, this is why the regional scale is so important. If you look at the Middle East is a site of conflict, and it has been for many decades. And this, again, is a bigger question, which we can talk about later. But the one consequence of this is that you have a lot of displaced peoples, including displaced bourgeoisies. So the Palestinian bourgeoisie, displaced in 1948. Many of them moved to places like Lebanon, Jordan, and the Gulf areas. And their centers of accumulation, not in the West Bank, certainly not in Gaza. The center of accumulation of the Palestinian bourgeoisie is in Saudi Arabia, it's in the UAE. So how do we think of these kind of diaspora bourgeois classes? We can say the same thing about the Iraqi bourgeoisie after 2003. We can say the same thing about Lebanese, Jordanians. The Gulf has become center of capital accumulation in the region for these diaspora bourgeois classes. So to think in that regional scale, I think, is really key, and we can understand then capitalism at that regional scale in a much more nuanced sense. In other words, seeing accumulation taking place in various ways in Saudi or Kuwait or UAE or Qatar, and the ways that other regional bourgeoisies have that as their base, and often it's recognized through citizenship. So you will have key Hariri in Lebanon, getting Saudi citizenship. Both there are Palestinian figures in the same kind of thing. You could point to the same kind of thing. So the way citizenship again is not. We need to think about the ways these individuals accumulate through different spaces, but also carry different nationalities as part of that.
Just as an aside, I mean, often the focus on national bourgeoisies and uh, is linked politically to a strategy, what's known as a stages strategy or popular front type strategy, where first the force of the left are fighting for national independence or bourgeois democratic revolution, and then the task of socialism is put on the agenda for the future. Um, I had a bit of a discussion about this with Andreas Malm, and he argues that, for example, the PFLP in Palestine went beyond this, did not have a kind of stages conception of Palestinian liberation, but more of a permanentist, if you like, or continuist notion of how they saw the strategy of Palestinian liberation. Is that something you'd agree with, or?
Uh, no, I think I would differ with Andreas on this point, in the sense that, I mean, it is, we need to look beyond simply what's written, and look at the practices of people and activists on the ground. And in that sense, I think there's not a homogenous way of responding to that. But I think if you look at particularly the Palestinian case, that stagist orientation has been present throughout virtually all of the left. The fact that the Palestinian Authority, formed through the Oslo Accords in the 90s, was very much the social base of that was this Palestinian bourgeoisie, keeping in mind what I said, that the accumulation of this bourgeoisie was not in Palestine, but actually outside and principally in the Gulf. But what happened, I think, to the left, not just the PFLP, but other forces of the left, is they became dependent upon the PA, even though being outwardly critical of the PA, but dependent upon the PA in many ways for their, the reproduction of the organization. So I do think this kind of stages view is problematic and has had a detrimental impact on not just the Palestinian struggle, but Egypt, Lebanon, and elsewhere.
So to move to the question of the Gulf, which is the subject of two previous books by you, Capitalism and Class in the Gulf Arab States from 2011, and Money, Markets and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East in 2018. I mean, one of the overshadowing presences, I think, both probably for you and for us on this question is the work of Fred Halliday, who very much initiated the kind of Marxist analysis of the Gulf through the book Arabia Without Sultans and his other work on Yemen and Iran and so on and so forth. And that was very important pioneering work. And then we have to deal with the other side, which is his later trajectory and his support for Gulf War and so on. How would you assess the legacy of Fred Halliday in the analysis of the role of capitalism in the Gulf?
I mean, I think the earlier work you pointed to is really groundbreaking, and I think also opened up a lot of ways of thinking and Marxist work on the region, particularly in the English-speaking world. I do think we need to remember that his work and his writing was very much connected to his political engagement with the revolutions and the revolutionary movements in the Gulf. And I think one of the most valuable aspects to it, particularly looking back on that moment now, 20, 30 years in advance, is really realizing that the left and Marxist thought was really present in places like Yemen and Oman, in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and other areas that we often think of these places as being simply apolitical. But no, there really was a moment of decades-long struggle, and I think Fred Halliday's work really brought that out. But he was able to do that because of his connections to different organizations and struggles in the region itself. So he wasn't like an individual ivory tower academic in that respect. So his engagement with those movements, part of a broader, I think, orientation of people in Europe, in the United States, also working. The magazine Merit, for example, I think played a really important role in thinking through these questions. So
Hamzine as well.
yes, Hamzine, yes. So those, I think that's important. I one of the weaknesses, I think, though, in some of that work of Fred Halliday and others, is that it lacked, if you like, I think, a kind of forensic examination of accumulation in the Gulf. And we're talking here about the 70s, and so it's some of the processes that are, I think, very clear today were only kind of embryonic back then. And there is a tendency to kind of reduce everything to just oil rents and oil wealth coming in, and not really seeing that there are sites of accumulation that are obviously connected to oil wealth, but they include the urban space, the ways that rents circulate through urban development, through construction, through retail, through banking and finance. So really trying to understand, if you like, the circuit of capital in its complete sense, as different points of accumulation where Gulf capital profits and is structured around this. So the earlier book you mentioned, Capitalism, Class in the Gulf Arab States, really tried to do that at the level of capitalist classes in the Gulf, to think about it through the lens of Marx's concept of the circuit of capital. There being productive moments, the financial sector, as well as the realization of value through shopping malls and sale of goods and that kind of thing. And if you examine those sectors in each of the Gulf states, and you look at the ownership of capital, the activities that take place, it's very clear that capitalist classes are active in all those levels. But interestingly, they're structured in a kind of conglomerate structure, in some ways similar to South Korea, Japan, where you have these large conglomerates that are active in different sectors, owned often by families, older merchant families, but really active across the whole circuit of capital. So trying to understand those conglomerates was a key aim of that book, and also to try to understand it in relation to the ruling families and the state. Because I think one of the problems in the way that the Gulf is typically seen, and this is a legacy of kind of Weberian understandings of the state, is that the state is seen as being all-powerful, and private capital is seen as being weak. This is the classic way of thinking about the Gulf. It's a rentier state theory, the idea that the state is all-determining, it controls everything, and then private capital is weak. And I think
partly because most of these are not bourgeois democracies in any recognizable sense. So
that's true. But if you look at the structure of capital in these states, it's clear that the private the members of the ruling family are both private capitalists. They operate as private individuals. They own some of these conglomerates. They're active in private accumulation, as well as being present in the state, and vice versa. You will find like these conglomerates will also be active within the state structure. So this dichotomy of state and capital, which is, I think, the legacy of this Weberian framework, is really, I think, falls apart. And I think this is true not just in the case of the Gulf, but it is, I think, a paradigmatic example in that sense. So that's, I think, one of the things we can learn through taking the Gulf seriously. And not just as this kind of oil spigot, which is what a lot of work, and unfortunately a lot of Marxist work, I think, treats the region as.
I mean, what you said about the legacy of the left insurgent movements and so on is very important. But surely what is also important is the way that once those threats had been headed off, the Gulf states were able to reconstruct their social formations in such a way that for large numbers of those countries anyway, there is no native working class. The working class is a migrant working class, and they're able to, well, crudely speaking, buy off the majority of the native population. That is pretty unique kind of configuration, wouldn't you say, in the history of world capitalism, or not?
This is a really central point, and you're absolutely right in the sense that what happened through the 70s, one of the ways that these militant movements, left movements, and different insurgent forces were defeated. Partly they were defeated through the intervention of imperial forces, particularly Britain, but also Iran played a major role at this point, being an ally of the United States. But one of the transformations that happened in capitalism in the Gulf at this moment was the kind of real shift to large working classes based upon non-citizen labor, migrant workers who lacked citizenship status. Initially, this was through mostly from the Arab world, Egyptians, Palestinians, Jordanians, Lebanese, Yemenis, and so forth. Later on, it shifted more to South Asia as being the predominant source of migrant workers, Filipinos, and elsewhere. So you're absolutely right in the sense that when we think about labor, and this is another, I think, problem with the way that the Gulf is often thought about, because people talk about these societies as if oil structures everything, but actually taking seriously the class structures requires understanding that the working class, and there is a huge working class, is actually non-citizen. So, and there's no viable route in most cases to citizenship in the Gulf, except unless you are one of those diaspora bourgeoisies that I spoke about earlier, Palestinian or Iraqi or so forth. But if you are an Indian construction worker or whatever, no matter how long you've been based in the region, there's no permanent route. So what this does is it does a number of things. One, it means that any sign of kind of labor action, any kind of political organization, those workers can simply be sent home, and they are repeatedly. And there are strikes, but the leaders and those engaged in that will simply be sent back to their places of origin. It means also that the citizen population in these states become integrated into the way that those migrant populations are controlled, because there's something called the kafala system, which is basically like work permits, and it is the citizen population and companies and so forth in the Gulf that have the right to bring workers in through this permit system. So they themselves then become the most direct layer that is controlling the migrant workforce. It's the private citizen population that is basically the interface between the state and the working class. So that is another way I think this kind of citizen layers get incorporated into the social power in the Gulf states. Now, this is not to say that there aren't poor citizens. There are in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, in Bahrain, where there's been continued militant uprisings, and 2011 being one clear example of this. But without foregrounding the fact that half of the labor force, more than half of the labor force in all of the Gulf monarchies are made up of non-citizen labor, it's impossible to understand how capitalism operates in the region. Now, the 2 points to this, other points that I think are really important. Firstly, it tells us something about what happens at moments of crisis, capitalist crisis. So, for example, 2008, the global economic crisis, it hit the Gulf states in a big way, partly due to the collapse of the real estate sector in places like Dubai. But what capitalism in the Gulf is able to do at that moment is simply send workers home, which is not possible to the same degree in places like the UK or the US or elsewhere. So what that means is that crises, when they hit the Gulf states, are transmitted into the labor sending countries. It's the countrysides of Pakistan, the countrysides of India that really feel, because of the lack of remittances and the lack of labor now, because of these deportations. So this was very clear, happened after the 2008 crisis, and it happened again more recently in COVID, a similar process.
It's kind of a chemically pure version of a surplus population, really.
Exactly, and it's a way of to use Harvey's term of a spatial displacement of crisis. That the crisis is spatially displaced through the corridors of migration to the countrysides of Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and elsewhere. Not saying, of course, that these Dubai and elsewhere didn't feel the crisis. They obviously did, but this is one way that crisis is displaced. So that's one thing. But the second thing that's important about this structure, and this coming back to the point you made about how unique or how specific this is, it is true that there's nowhere else on the planet where you have such a high degree of labor forces that are made up of non-citizen migrant workers. However, I do think it does prefigure in very clear ways trends that are happening elsewhere in the world. Australia is a clear example of this. The UK is a clear example, and the United States is a very clear example, where significant proportion of work is done by non-citizen and so-called illegal workforce in some cases. Moments of crisis, those people are obviously the first to be sent home. And I think this is something I've felt living in the UK for a decade or so now. You can really see the ways that the private mediation of migrant labor is or the way that kind of control of migrant labor is concentrated among citizen populations. So when a private landlord in London has to check the immigration status of one of their renters, or an academic has to check the immigration status of their students, or a doctor has to do so in the NHS, you can see the similar process of what I described in the Gulf, where the actual control of the labor force takes place at the level of the citizen population to a significant degree, and incorporates, therefore, the citizen population into the kind of bigger power structures of capital.
Yeah, scary prospect. What would you see any? Would you say there are any fractures in this kind of dominant social bloc in the native populations that are developing, or do you think they're fairly solid and likely to continue for quite some time?
No, I think we need to be very careful not to kind of homogenize citizen populations in the Gulf. We need to think about the poverty that exists, literal poverty that exists among some layers of the Saudi citizen population. And Bahrain, where you have labor movements and strikes, Oman, similarly, Kuwait. So I think, though, one of the problems is the way that, and again, this is something that's not unique to the Gulf, but the way that non-citizen migrant workers are kind of set up as being the enemy, and are we need, I think, to think about, if we're thinking about, for example, class and labor in the Middle East, not simply the Gulf, but the whole of the Middle East region, those non-Arab, non-citizen migrant workforces are crucial components of the working classes in the Middle East, and they need to be seen as such by the left. We can't have this kind of nationally privileged view of who are workers. And this is even more pronounced today because of displacement. So we're not just talking about the Indian, Bangladeshi, and so forth. We're talking also about refugees displaced from Syria, Palestinian refugees who are not simply refugees. They are inevitably incorporated into labor structures. They're workers when they're displaced across borders or internally. So, somewhere like Lebanon, where a quarter of the population is made up of refugees, those displaced people, again, they're Arab, but they're not citizens of the places they're displaced to, are part of the working classes in these countries. So there's a whole story to be told about how we think about labor in the Middle East beyond these kind of national and methodologically nationalist perspectives.
How does the particular composition of capitalism in the Gulf relate to the dominant forms of religion? The fact that most of these states are dominated by very orthodox / fundamentalist / whatever you want to call them forms of Islam, which would tend to undermine the kind of perhaps naive wager that the more capitalism develops, the more religiosity, at least in its highly structured institutional forms, tends to melt away in the icy waters of capitalist calculation. How do you understand that relationship between the form of capitalism you're describing and the particular forms of Islam that are dominant?
Well, I mean, in the case of the Gulf, it's obviously Saudi Arabia's place as a center of Islam, the holy places is a that's quite important to how the state emerged and the kinds of ideologies of the state developed in Saudi Arabia. It's also important because it is a major center of accumulation, because pilgrims from all over the world come and visit these sites. So it is actually an important point of how capital operates at that level. But in an ideological sense, I think the question of the kind of ebbs and flows of Islamic or fundamentalist kind of beliefs really can't be separated from the ebbs and flows of the left and kind of more the struggles of communist movements and other movements. So if you look historically, it's very clear, I think, what's the dominant character. There was a point in the 60s and 70s in the Gulf where the movements, the political movements, were leftist movements. Similarly in Palestine, in Lebanon, and you can see the kind of, for all the reasons that we've talked about, the kind of weaknesses of those left movements have been filled by the rise of Islamic and Islamist forces, and this has become another route through which the Gulf states has also projected its power in the region through sponsoring different movements. Particularly, you can see this in the case of Qatar. You can see it in the case of Saudi Arabia historically, using Islam as a way to kind of undercut the left and progressive forces.
To finish on the Gulf, how does this conception of the way this particularly regionally integrated and internationalized form of capitalism in the Gulf, how does this relate to the national question, particularly the Palestinian national question? I mean, before October the 7th, there was a lot of talk about the Abraham Accords and the idea of a kind of global settlement between the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and Israel, and that would fit this idea of this integrated form of capitalism, regionally integrated form of capitalism, and yet obviously now the situation has changed. Do you think those long-term structural tendencies are likely to reassert themselves, or do you think that the question of Palestine is now a big it has become an obstacle to that?
Well, I think to answer that question, we need to think about the place of the Middle East, and this, leads us very clearly into the questions of oil, but the place of the Middle East in American power, and the way that, if you look at American dominance in the region, it's been based on two major pillars. One, the Gulf states, particularly after the Second World War and after the 1970s in particular. Saudi Arabia becomes a major ally of US imperialism in the region. And then the second kind of pillar is Israel, particularly after the 1967 war. So these two pillars of American power really kind of underpin the way that US interests in the region have operated. What the Americans have tried to do over the last couple of decades is kind of knit these powers together to assert its dominance through the normalization of the Gulf and Israel. Now, the obstacle to that is, of course, the Palestinian people, or a major obstacle is the Palestinian people and the dispossession of Palestinians. So the Oslo Accords, through the 90s and the creation of the Palestinian Authority, was an attempt to kind of undercut the Palestinian movement, to integrate Israel into the wider region and to promote this normalization. And from the perspective of the United States and Europe, that was a major success. Israel did normalize with Jordan and Egypt. Later on, through the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain. It's clear in the current moment the way that these states are supporting Israel, despite the rhetoric of what they say. So I do think the longer term strategy at the moment is to continue this normalization process. And I think Saudi Arabia has made it, I think, very clear that there's no kind of principal objection to normalizing with Israel. I'm certain that the UAE and Bahrain wouldn't have been able to do so without the consent of Saudi Arabia. So I certainly think I think it's on the cards, and I think in terms of any kind of final settlement that might emerge in the post-war scenario, that's certainly the long game that the United States is playing for.
But there they would have a population, some of them at least would have a problem with their native populations, because support for Palestine is still quite strong and is likely to grow the more and more Israel pursues this genocidal and ethnic cleansing logic. So
absolutely. I mean, this is again not just a question of the Gulf, what's going on in the Gulf, but you can see it in Egypt very clearly. Last week, Israeli warships moving through the Suez Canal, protected by Egypt, and outrage from the populations in the Egyptian population. So that's absolutely true. But here again is where the Palestinian Authority really is key, because if the PA provides a green light to some kind of settlement, that's what they are looking for, and that's been the role of the PA since the 1990s, the Oslo Accords, and it remains so today. So thinking about this as not just this moment of genocide, but the longer durée of the 1990s in particular, and what Oslo represented, is really key. We can't understand this current moment without looking at what Oslo did and what it continues to do. Oslo never died. It's still there. And this kind of, alternating between, moments of extreme violence by the Israeli state and then moments of negotiation and so-called peaceful settlements has been the modus vivendi of Israel and the Americans for 3 decades now. It's not new, and it will certainly, I think, resurface in any kind of post-war scenarios.
So to move on to crude capitalism, oil, corporate power, and the making of the world market, perhaps you could explain a bit what you felt so unhappy with in terms of the or inadequate or partial about the discussions of oil generally and perhaps also on the left, and what you feel you wanted to do with this book in terms of the original contribution of the analysis.
Well, part of it comes out of my earlier work, obviously, on the Gulf and thinking about the way that oil is generally theorized in relation to the Gulf states and capitalism in the Gulf. I mentioned earlier this idea of the rentier state, strong states, weak private capital. Oil is basically seen as determining everything. The lack of democracy, the nature of state power, the ruling families, wars, exactly.
Oil, yeah.
Yes. So, and thinking about this, and for all the reasons we've talked about, seeing this as deeply problematic, but really, I think trying to ground the weakness of these approaches in the idea of commodity fetishism, Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, basically giving a commodity like oil power, but doing so separating that commodity from the social relations in which it's embedded. That's the fundamental problem with the rentier state approach, and it to me is the problem with the way a lot of oil is talked about. We think about, if we think about how you describe oil, there's oil as the prize, or the oil curse. The famous line by the sense that oil has this innate power that is separated from capitalism. So I'm not saying there I think there are some great writers and scholars, many of them writing with verso, people like Andreas Malm and Matt Huber and others, Michael Watts, very important kinds of thinking through this implications of commodity fetishism. So, but what I was trying to do was to think about what is it about capitalism that gives oil meaning, because at the end of the day, oil is just a sticky black goo. Okay, but where does it get its apparent power from? What are the, if you like, tendencies or laws, forms of motion of capitalism that gives oil a particular significance and this apparent power over us today? So, we can talk here, and I talk in the book around things like, this tendency towards ever accelerating accumulation, the speeding up of the turnover time of capital. The idea is that capitalism is always trying to speed up circulation and increase consumption through that way. The replacement of living labor by dead labor, organic composition of capital, all of these things that are inherent to capitalism as a social system, and through that give a particular meaning to oil as a form of as an energy source. So that's where the kind of theoretical impulse of the book is coming from. But to write, I tried to write this book in a kind of way that was historical, in the sense that to describe this process historically, and particularly the key point being the mid-20th century, in the 1950s or so, after the Second World War, where oil supplants coal as the principal fossil fuel. So that's one kind of, if you like, leg on which the book is based. But the other part is and this follows, I think, on from that, is to think about oil not simply as its crude form, but to think about what oil becomes as it circulates through capitalism. So oil is in its crude form is basically useless. It has to be turned into something else. It becomes a fuel. It becomes refined into petrochemicals, into plastics. And thinking about this process of what oil actually becomes as it moves through different circuits, really I think points to the way that oil is essentially everywhere. It's not simply a transport fuel. It's embedded in the clothes we wear. It's embedded in rubbers, in plastics, and so thinking about oil in that sense, I think is really important. I think it's often missed because oil is treated as being like these underground reserves, the underground prize that people are seeking to control, but rather than thinking actually what does it become within capitalist economies.
I mean, I was quite struck when the discussions about the question of the congruence between fossil fuels, and particularly oil, and capitalism. I mean, obviously, capitalism didn't need fossil fuels or indeed oil to commit some of its worst crimes: the slave trade, primitive accumulation, dispossession of the peasantry, and so on and so forth. But it is true that there's something you make an argument about this congruence. I mean, do you think it's possible to imagine a form of capitalism, globalized capitalism of the type that we know today without oil?
I mean, this is a question I know it's raised thinking about, and in a way, the question is a bit, I think, misleading in the sense that capitalism is always historical and concrete, and we can see, the place that coal played. Andreas Malm has written on this, but the place that coal played in the emergence of the British Empire, and the kind of making of the world market that came through that early moment of coal as a principal fossil fuel. I think one of the problems with the way that a lot of these debates about fossil fuels and the possible transition out of fossil fuels is thought about is that these moments of transition are seen as being the replacement of one fossil fuel by the other, or one energy source by the other. Whereas in reality, if you look historically, because of this voracious demand for energy that's inherent to capitalism, we actually see different energy sources being overlaid on one another.
Yeah, it's a point Jean-Baptiste Fressoz makes in his last book about the fact that we're not talking about consecutive energy sources, but additive.
Absolutely. And I think this is really key when we're thinking about the so-called green transition, because I don't think I think the green transition is a myth. It's not happening. There are, of course, renewable energy sources coming online, and there more and more will come online, but they're not replacing or displacing fossil fuels. They're added on top of it. So in that sense, I think it's important to think about these transitions absolutely as additive.
I mean, also, it seems to me what you're trying to do with the book is two other things. One is to talk about the relationship between oil and finance, and the central relationship interaction there. And the other is to go beyond the Gulf, or go beyond indeed just the Gulf and the US. You start the story in the US, obviously, but to try and give a much more global synoptic account of the role of oil up to today. So you have a chapter, for example, on Russia and Baku and the Russian Revolution. You have a chapter on Russia. You have a chapter on you discussed China and East Asia. Maybe you could say something about those two aspects of what you feel you're adding to.
Well, the question of finance is really key, and it comes back to the point that I was making, that we need to think about oil as it moves through capitalism. One of the things that happens here, of course, is oil wealth. So thinking about where these oil where oil wealth circulates, and again thinking about it quite historically, is really key to how the financial architecture that we live under emerged. So there's the subtitle of the book is The Making of the World Market, And the reason that's there is to think about the so-called transition from coal to oil being occurring at the same time as the emergence of the United States as the dominant global power in the mid-20th century. So to think about these two transitions and the way they fed into one another, and a really important part of that was the way that US dominance over global finance emerged through that post-war movement, and particularly through the 1970s. And this is inseparable from the Gulf and kind of the petrodollar flows that accumulated in places like Saudi Arabia, the way they were incorporated into the positioning of the US dollar as world money, the way they reinforced the centrality of Anglo-American financial institutions, the particular role that London played within that as a financial center. And I think this is really an interesting point. Again, Tony Norfield, history of the city of London, I think really kind of echoes a lot of these points in the sense that the role of British colonialism in the Gulf states, in the Middle East, and the recirculation of oil wealth pre-US dominance in the early 20th century was quite fundamental to how London emerged as a key financial center, and later on how British capitalism was incorporated as a subordinate but important part of the US-dominated world system. So again, oil is really key to all of these points. Thinking, for example, about the US-British relationship can't be thought about separate from those histories of colonialism and oil in places like the Middle East. So that's one thing. So oil as finance, the power of the US dollar, and so forth. But the other aspect to your question about these other places of the world oil industry, the Russian story of Russia to me is absolutely fascinating, and I think is again missed out in a lot of the kind of narratives that focus on the United States, because and these are in many ways, there's a chapter here about the if you like, the unintended consequences of the 1917 revolution. The fact that Baku in Azerbaijan, where the COP29 is about to happen, this was, about half of, in the early 1900s, about half of the world's oil production was taking place in Baku. The major companies and entities who controlled that oil were mostly European or Russian. They weren't American. But what happened after 1917 is that the Bolsheviks nationalized oil. And again, this was the first time oil was nationalized without compensation in history. It was before Mexico, it was before Bolivia, which are often seen as the first examples of nationalization of oil, certainly before OPEC. But what this did was it basically cut those European firms out of access to those oil reserves. Later on, the Russian or the Bolshevik Party, signs deals with American companies to basically bring in expertise and to exploit those resources. So it's really interesting, I think, the way that the Western oil industry, and particularly the dominance of the American oil firms, were an unintended consequence of that Bolshevik experience. So it's really, I think, important to kind of center that. There's all these fascinating discussions about the questions of national independence in the Bolshevik debates, the questions of nationalization of resources, labor, all of these things that were like many people know, there were debates between Lenin and Stalin about national independence and the rights of national minorities, but they were actually quite closely connected to the question of oil, because oil at that moment is emerging as the principal fossil fuel. It becomes also the main source of hard currency for the Russian state. So those stories are really, really, really interesting. the other point you make around the rise more recently of China and East Asia is I think so important to understanding what the world oil industry looks like today and the place of fossil fuels in capitalism. Because the rise of China as a major center of global accumulation in the 1990s, beginning in the 1990s, accelerating obviously since then, center of manufacturing, depended upon oil, both as a fuel but also as petrochemical raw materials in the form of petrochemicals and plastics. So what you see happening at this moment is that the oil suppliers of the Middle East essentially reorient towards the East, export of crude oil and refined products to China and wider East Asia. So today, about 20% of the world's imports of oil go to China, which is remarkable. It's completely transformed the nature of the world oil trade over the last 20 years. So, I describe this as kind of the East-East hydrocarbon axis, in the sense that you have these greater interdependencies forming between the Gulf states and China, East Asia, that are partly or very importantly connected to the export of crude oil, but also foreign direct investment flows, joint ownership structures, refined products, petrochemicals are really key to this. So the rise of China really cannot be separated from this reorientation of world oil. And I think this plays a big part of understanding also the politics of the Middle East today. And coming back to that point about the place of Israel and Saudi Arabia in the historical emergence of U.S. control of the region, the question of relative decline of American power, the rise of alternative powers in China and elsewhere, really give even more importance to the Israel's Gulf process as pillars of American power in the region.
One way people have, particularly I'm thinking of the Zetkin Collective and the book we did on fossil fuel fascism. One way people have started to think about this and the relationship to global capitalism is to try and revert to a kind of Poulantsian discussion about fractions of capital and fossil fuel fraction of capital against other fractions of capital. Is that something you find a useful way of thinking about oil, for example?
I've never really thought this idea of fractions of capital is a persuasive one. Partly because if you look at how capital is organized and ownership of capital, and this is certainly the case in the Gulf, as I was saying, with the conglomerate structures, but I think it's true more widely, is that capital is active across all of these different sectors, and you cannot isolate out what is fossil. What is an oil capitalist? Now, there are obviously oil companies, but if you look at the ownership of these oil companies, the ones that are, most of them big ones listed on stock markets in the United States and Europe, the owners are finance capitalists. They're asset management firms, private equity firms. These are the big shareholders. And they're active both in owning the producing companies, ExxonMobil, etc., but they're also active on the financial markets where oil is traded. This is really, I think, key to understand that the price of oil isn't determined by OPEC. It's not determined by the oil producers. It's determined through financial markets where oil barrels are traded and speculated upon. And the kinds of big finance capitalists who are involved in those markets are the same ones that own the kind of productive, if quote unquote, sectors as well. So I don't think thinking about this in terms of fractions is a productive way.
What about the relationship between oil and revolutions. I mean, aside from the Russian Revolution, which, as you say, leads to this unintended consequence, we have two other cases of a relationship between oil and revolution. Let's say Venezuela, on the one hand, where oil did allow for a period of time the Chavez government to engage in substantial redistributive or substantial anti-poverty programs and social programs. And on the other side, Iran, clearly not a socialist experience, but one, I mean, it's difficult to imagine Iran positioning itself as a key player in the axis of resistance against Israel and American imperialism without oil wealth, without falling into the kind of all determinism. Neither, in both cases, it seems that oil hasn't led to particularly good results, except for a brief period in Venezuela. How would you understand that relationship between oil and either progressive or leftist governments on the one hand, or purportedly anti-imperialist regimes on the other?
I mean, I think in those cases we see again the way that oil wealth and the industry was really key to the emergence of national capitalist classes connected closely to the state, and I think that's the case in both Iran and Venezuela. We can see this, but I think what is unique, what is important to bring into this is the question of labor again, and workers, the working classes of these states, and again, this is where the specificity of the Gulf monarchies is quite important. The fact that in Iran you have historically had very militant labor movements certainly played a key role in, the oil workers played a key role in the 1979 revolution, and the kind of consolidation of the Islamic revolution was partly taken through the attacks on the left and trade union movements in places like Iran. So the class structure that we spoke of earlier in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and elsewhere is not the same. There wasn't that way of kind of. So I think that's part of why we can see the Gulf plays a very specific role in relation to American power. That wasn't the case in places like Iran and Venezuela, where oil did provide that opportunity for some kind of national capital, if you like, to emerge.
Maybe you'd like to say something about the relationship between this book and the current project that you're working on plastics.
Well, one of the really key arguments I try to make in this book is that, again, coming back to the fact that we need to see oil beyond just a transport fuel. We need to kind of really see that everything around us in this room is basically a product of oil. The clothes that I'm wearing, the paints, the rubbers, these artificial synthetic materials that are derived from oil, but oil as a raw material. And this was a really key turning point that took place again in the mid-20th century. And what it did was it certainly increased the power of the oil industry, because the oil industry suddenly became embedded in everything that's around us. But the other thing it did was it made oil invisible. And this, to me, is I think a really key point in understanding the power of the oil industry today, is that it's all around us. It's in everything we consume. Beyond material products, it's in fertilizers and all of these other kinds of ways it's deeply embedded in our daily lives, but we don't see it. It's become invisible. So thinking about this paradox that it's everywhere, but we don't see it is I think important to understanding the questions of climate change and the struggle against fossil fuels today. So that's kind of what I'm interested in very much exploring and thinking about plastics and petrochemicals beyond simply questions of recycling or toxic waste. Obviously, toxicity is important, but actually centering it as a story of climate change and fossil fuels, I think is really something that's often missed out in the climate movement today, thinking about these processes.
So we're talking on the 6th of November, having just discovered the crushing victory of Donald Trump in the American elections. Donald Trump, obviously, who has positioned himself as a great champion of fossil fuels and oil in particular. What do you think the consequences or dimensions of the of a new Trump administration are for the story of oil today?
I mean, it's clear that large parts of the American oil industry certainly backed the Trump campaign, particularly the fracking industry, shale industry, as well as ExxonMobil and these big Western American oil firms were, really, I think, gung ho about the Trump prospects, and partly this is to do with the prospects of further deregulation.
In an openly transactional way, which was quite amusing.
Yeah, opening up licenses and getting rid of environmental regulations, all part of the kind of Project 2025 program in many ways. So, I think in that respect, it's a disaster in what it means immediately. But I do think it's really important to understand that the oil industry was also central to the Democratic Party. The US is the largest oil producer in the world today, and that happened under Obama and under Biden. That's how they became not just oil but also gas, the largest producers today. So when we're talking about the expansion of the oil industry, it happened under the Democratic Party. If we look at the so-called environmental programs that have been put forward under Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act, and so forth, the money that was provided for these, I explore some of these technologies and false solutions that are being put forward around the climate crisis in the final chapter of the book. But the money that's going into carbon capture, for example, or into biofuels, this money is largely flowing to fossil fuel companies, to oil companies. They are the ones that are raking in billions through these so-called green solutions. So I think really understanding this is a bipartisan approach, that neither of those two parties, I mean, this is not something that will be surprising to many people listening to this, but there is one party of American capital, and there are two factions, and I think that's pretty clear. So not the Democratic Party not letting them off the hook for the genocide in Palestine, obviously, but also they're backing to the hilt of the fossil fuel industry.
What about COP29 and the policy debates and full solutions that are on the table at the moment to deal with fossil fuels and climate change?
Well, I think it's really interesting to look at the kind of transformation of the oil industry over the last 20 years, or 30 years or so. ExxonMobil has, been the dominant force globally for much of that period, for much of the history of oil. And back in the 70s, their own scientists were very accurately forecasting the impact of climate change and warning of the dangers of climate change. And the big Western oil companies took the position of denialism, which is resurfacing also today among elements of the Trump campaign and so forth. But it is interesting, I think, to see the way that in the current moment the oil industry has really pivoted towards a whole range of false solutions, and really seeing these solutions as a way of making sure that fossil fuels remain absolutely central, and accelerating the production of fossil fuels. So we're talking here about things like carbon capture, carbon capture and storage. We're talking here about things like the biofuel industries, electric vehicles, hydrogen is a big one. All of these techno fixes that actually do not deal with the fundamental problem, that are being steered by oil companies, and that are actually embedding oil even more centrally into our world. So that's one side, and we can see, I think, in the policy forums like the COP process, that is really one strand. COP29, I think, is interesting because of the debates around climate finance, and the ways in which there's an emerging emphasis on kind of private sector-led investments, and into climate mitigation and so forth. But again, this is a model of dealing with the climate crisis that is focused around capitalist solutions, and it's even going to more centrally strengthen these interests. But I think the really interesting thing, to bring it back to these big oil-producing states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Azerbaijan, and Brazil next year, is the way that these states are really steering the direction of the debates around climate change. So it's in some ways different from the big Western oil companies, in the sense that these firms are, these countries are actually at the table. They're making the policies, and you can see the imprint of it in the debates at COP. So it's a disastrous situation in that sense, to leave climate policy in the hands of essentially the oil industry.
So maybe we could end on the question of Palestine and the current situation and how you see it being played out. So in terms of the current situation, I mean, obviously it's quite difficult to read, because on the one hand, one could place a lot of emphasis on the real ideological and political strength of the far right in Israel today, and their particular place and influence within the current regime, which could lead one to imagine that Israel is tending towards more and more kind of an intentional, has a plan really, and there's a strong intentionality to what it's doing. On the other hand, one could argue that fighting a three-cornered war against Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran is probably not the most rational thing for Israel to do at the moment. What for you is the balance between, on the one hand, the ideological question of the role of the far right, and some of which is truly messianic in its conception of a greater Israel, and on the other hand, the role of the structural position of Israel and its need to maintain its relationship to the US and to the West generally, and act as a local policeman. How do you read that balance at the moment?
I mean, I think it's really important to center that US-Israel relationship. I think there's a lot of problems with the way that's generally thought about. People talk about the lobby argument, for example, that US policy is driven by some Israel lobby. I think that's completely nonsense in the sense. I mean, there is a lobby, but it doesn't run the US policy or US government. It's much more the other way around. The US, as we've discussed, really sees Israel, because of its settler colonial character, the fact that it is based upon the dispossession of the Palestinian population. It sees Israel as a loyal gendarme in the region, and that's been the case for many decades, certainly after 1967 war. So I think this is why a lot of the discussions about the recent elections in the US and the kind of attempts by the Democratic Party to say, well, we're trying to bring Israel into line, etc., were complete nonsense, in the sense that it's the US that is arming this genocide. It's the US that is financing the genocide. And perhaps most importantly, it's the US that is allowing it politically to continue. So I think to really see that that relationship is key. Now, inside Israel, absolutely, you're right. There are different political forces. There is a rise of the messianic far right. It's not new; it's always been there, but it's kind of taken a much more prominent role in policy over the last and kind of politics over the last years. But I think ultimately that connection with the United States is what is driving this, and it's what's going to determine the kind of character of what comes next. So coming back to what I said earlier, thinking about the current moment, this moment of extreme violence, this moment of genocide in the context of the Oslo process, the normalization, the role of the Palestinian Authority, the role of the Gulf, the role of places like Egypt, can't be left out of the equation. That this is a continuum. It's not a sudden, bizarre break in Israeli policy. It's a continuum that's been present for many decades, and that's how we need to see the current moment.
Yeah, I mean, one can see continuity, but one can also see accelerations and ruptures within continuities. It's not a choice between either total breaks or total continuity. I mean, what do you see the end game in Gaza, for example, as for Israel being? It seems that, northern Gaza is being cleared either for full-scale military occupation and or also recolonization. But it seems also that the wish of some, at least, for mass expulsion of the Palestinian Gazan population into Sinai didn't work out. The Egyptians wouldn't play ball on that. So what do you see as the end game for the Israelis in the specifically Gazan context?
I mean, it's difficult to kind of speculate. I mean, I do think that there is this sense of I think it would be very difficult for Israel to occupy directly in a military sense permanently the Gaza Strip. They are, I think, will need to look for some kind of regional force or local force that is willing to kind of rule in the same kind of way that the Palestinian Authority has done in the West Bank.
A real comprador bourgeoisie.
Yeah. Now, whether they'll be successful in finding people who are willing to do that, I think is really the big question that's on the table. But the total destruction of Gazan society is really the key question, because this is destruction not just in terms of human life, but also infrastructure, environment, the whole kind of livability of the Gaza Strip is now in question. So that, I think, is really the bigger question than simply the political arrangements that we'll see post the war.
And this talk about gas fields off the Gaza coast and so on. I mean, what? How do you read that? Is that a sort of also a fantasy that revenues from fossil fuels will allow the Israelis to consolidate a kind of a supine Palestinian bourgeoisie, or what?
I mean, there are certainly gas fields off the coast of Israel, partly in Palestinian waters, into Gazan waters. There is the complicity of Western oil firms in exploiting these reserves, both oil and gas. I think in terms, I don't think this was kind of a motivating force of the war at all. I don't think it's in terms of the Israeli economy a major a major factor in that sense. I think there's an attempt by the Europeans to perhaps draw upon some of these oil gas reserves in the current moment as a replacement for Russian reserves. But I think it plays even a bigger role in the sense of how these energy reserves are part of how Egypt and Israel have been normalizing, because a lot of the export of these fuels now take place through Egypt, where they're refined and then exported further afield. So there's a kind of political overlay on top of these energy resources that are deepening the integration of Israel with neighboring states like Egypt and also with Jordan.